The sun was setting slowly over the mountains, and the little village was filled with visitors. Food stalls spilled their smells into the cool air, lanterns swayed in the breeze, and families wandered between cobblestone alleys. Children laughed as they chased each other near the park where an old fountain stood at the center. Beneath this cheerfulness, hidden in the shadows of the square, padded a scruffy dog with fur matted from rain and dust. His ribs showed through his thin coat, and his brown eyes carried both longing and sorrow. The villagers knew him as Max. He was always there, wagging his tail at strangers, hoping for a gentle hand or a piece of bread. Though he had no collar, no rope, no clear owner, Max was never truly wild. He had the look of a creature who once belonged, a dog that carried faint memories of trust. As the crowd thickened that evening, a group of tourists noticed him. At first their attention was harmless, curious glances and small giggles from children who pointed and whispered. But then one young man bent down, his hand closing around a small stone. The first throw made Max jump with fright, his tail tucking instantly between his legs. The sharp sound of laughter followed, louder than the weak protests of villagers who looked away rather than confront the strangers. Another stone flew, striking his side, and the dog whimpered in pain. Soon more rocks followed, tossed by careless hands, each one heavier than the last, each one striking not only his body but also the fragile trust he still had in humans. Max stumbled, limping away from the open square toward the edge of the park, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. He squeezed himself beneath a wooden bench, his body shivering, his breath shallow. The lights of the village glowed around him, but none of it mattered. He only felt the betrayal. Once again people had proven themselves cruel. He did not know that his story was far from over, that fate was already moving pieces far beyond his sight. For in another town, miles away, a man sat in silence, unaware that the dog he loved more than any medal or honor was tonight lying hurt and broken. This man was Thomas Bennett, once a general who commanded battalions, now an aging soldier who sought peace. His heart was about to be called back into battle, not of guns and soldiers, but of loyalty, justice, and redemption. And Max, the frail dog beneath the bench, was the reason. In a quiet town nearly 50 miles from the mountain village, Thomas Bennett sat alone in his modest study. The evening was calm, the air filled with the faint scent of tea leaves rising from a steaming cup beside him. His house was small but lined with memories. The walls carried photographs of younger days when his uniform carried weight and respect. Medals gleamed under the dim light, each one a reminder of battles fought, of men he had led, of a past soaked in both pride and pain. Yet on his desk lay softer memories, framed pictures of a loyal companion with bright eyes and a wagging tail. The dog was Max, a pup once full of endless energy, who had followed Thomas on countless hikes through the countryside. 4 years they had been inseparable, until illness forced the general to leave Max in the care of a trusted friend in a neighboring village. Though Thomas had recovered, he had never managed to bring his dog home again. He often wondered if Max was thriving, if he had found happiness, if the friend had kept the promise of care. The phone rang that night, slicing through the silence with a shrill urgency. At first Thomas hesitated, his hand hovering above the receiver. Few called him at such an hour. When he finally answered, the voice on the other side trembled with unease. It was CLA, a shopkeeper from the very village where Max had been left. Her tone was laced with fear and sorrow. "General, it is Max. Something terrible happened." Thrown words spilled into his ear, broken fragments that painted a picture of cruelty. Tourists, stones, pain, hiding, alive but wounded. CLA's voice faltered, as if even repeating the story made her feel shame. For she had seen what happened and could do nothing. The general felt his heart sink, a cold weight pressing into his chest. His vision blurred as rage and grief collided. Max, his loyal friend, betrayed and harmed by careless hands. He did not need to hear more. He placed the cup aside, grabbed his coat with steady hands, and moved with the discipline of a soldier preparing for battle. His mind sharpened as he drove through the night. Every mile that passed was filled with memories of Max as a pup chasing butterflies, splashing into rivers, curling up beside him by the fire. He remembered the nights in the wilderness when only Max's steady breathing reminded him that he was not alone. To imagine him hurt, bleeding, cowering beneath a bench was unbearable. His grip tightened on the wheel. Though his hair was gray and his shoulders less broad than they once were, Thomas still carried the presence of command. He had lived through chaos, but this was personal. This was family. By the time he reached the village, the air was cold and the streets dimly lit. Midnight shadows fell long across cobblestone paths. Ciele awaited him outside her small shop, a flashlight in one hand, worry etched deep into her face. She explained how she had tried to search but feared scaring Max deeper into hiding. Together they walked toward the park, the crunch of gravel beneath their steps echoing into the silence of night. The village that had been lively hours before now seemed haunted by guilt, its silence a reminder of what had been allowed to happen. Thomas called softly, his voice low and steady. "Max, it is me, old boy. You are safe now." The sound drifted into the still air, carried like a promise. At first there was nothing. Then a faint rustle came from beneath a bench. Thomas crouched, his flashlight revealing a heartbreaking sight. Max lay curled in dirt and blood, his fur tangled with dust, his eyes dull with exhaustion and fear. Yet when those eyes met the general's, something shifted. A faint wag of the tail, weak but full of recognition. A spark of trust not yet extinguished. Thomas reached slowly, his hands steady though his heart shook inside him. "Easy now," he murmured, though no words were needed. The blanket he carried wrapped gently around the frail body. Max whimpered but did not resist. He was lifted into familiar arms that once carried him as a pup. Thomas rose, his face carved with determination. He would not let this cruelty stand. As they returned to Ciele's shop, the general's mind churned. This was not simply about punishing strangers. It was about justice, about dignity, about teaching a lesson that would echo through the community. They cleaned the wounds, offered warm food, and laid Max on a soft bed. His head rested on Thomas's lap, eyes finally closing in fragile peace. The general stroked his fur, whispering silent vows. The tourists would learn that every action carried weight, that every life had value. Morning broke over the village with whispers. Word of Thomas's arrival spread quickly. The villagers gathered in hushed tones, curious and cautious. Some admired his reputation, others felt shame for their silence the night before. The tourists who had mocked the dog laughed over drinks at the tavern, dismissing concerns with arrogance. "It is just a dog," one sneered. Yet already their fate was sealed, for they had underestimated both the loyalty of an animal and the resolve of the man who had once commanded legions. Before the sun had fully risen, Thomas was already moving. He spoke to every witness in the park, gathering details with the precision of an officer assembling intelligence. He listened carefully, noting descriptions of faces, voices, and laughter. His questions were calm, but his presence demanded honesty. By mid-morning he had enough to identify the culprit. He coordinated with the local constable, his military authority smoothing paths that hesitation might have blocked. But deep within, he knew punishment alone was too shallow. True justice lay not in fines or jail cells, but in transformation. The tourists needed to understand the weight of their cruelty, to feel it in their bones, to grow from it. When he entered the tavern later that day, silence fell like a curtain. Even without a uniform, his posture, his sharp gaze, his very presence spoke of discipline and strength. The group of 4 men and 2 women who had hurt Max froze in their seat. Their laughter faltered, their glasses paused halfway to their lip. Thomas approached them without hesitation. His words were calm, yet heavy with meaning. He made it clear that their actions had consequences, that what they dismissed as a joke was in truth a mark of their character. Their bravado cracked beneath his steady gaze. One tried to defend, another sneered, but their voices faltered. "It is never just a dog," he told them. "It is about respect for life, for others, for yourselves. You may not understand now, but you will." That evening he gathered the villagers in the square. Lanterns glowed against the approaching night. Chairs were set in a semicircle, faces turned toward the stage where Thomas stood with CLA at his side. The tourists were brought by the constable, nervous and uneasy. The general spoke with measured tone, his voice carrying across the crowd. "This is not only about them," he said. "It is about us as a community. Cruelty left unchecked grows into rot. We must decide what kind of people we wish to be." His words struck deep into hearts that had turned away the night before. Many felt the sting of guilt, ashamed that they had done nothing while stones struck an innocent creature. A projector lit up with images of animals rescued from neglect, scars etched across their bodies, eyes haunted by fear. Gasps rose from the audience. Thomas let the silence settle before speaking again. "This is what happens when we forget our humanity, when we treat life as disposable." The tourists shifted in their seats, their defiance crumbling under the weight of both shame and fear. Finally the general laid out his judgment. 2 weeks of service at the village animal shelter. They would clean, repair, and feed. They would face the very lives they once treated as worthless. And through the work they would learn, or they would break. The crowd murmured in agreement, their earlier passivity replaced by a spark of courage. The mayor nodded, the constable supported it, and the sentence was set. The tourists protested at first, muttering about rights and refusals, but Thomas silenced them with a simple truth. "You can walk away," he said, "but your names and actions will follow you home. The weight of shame is heavy, and it will not leave you." Slowly, reluctantly, they agreed. The next morning the sun rose over a different village. At the shelter, rusted fences leaned crooked, kennels sat broken, supplies scattered. The air smelled of hay and disinfectant, mingled with the sounds of soft barks and whimpers. The tourists stood uneasily at the gate, their clothes neat, their faces pale with discomfort. Thomas waited with CLA and a handful of volunteers. His voice was firm but even. "This is where you will work. From dawn until dusk. You will clean, repair, feed, and care. You will learn what it means to value a life you once ignored." The group exchanged glances, shifting feet, muttering doubts. Yet under his gaze they could not turn away. Thus began their reluctant journey. The first day was brutal. Cleaning kennels fouled with waste, carrying buckets of water, repairing broken plank. Sweat stained their shirts, dirt clung to their hands. Complaints rose, curses whispered, but work was done nonetheless. By midday, exhaustion forced them to sit beneath a tree. Their faces flushed, their backs sore. A small terrier approached, tail wagging timidly. One of the women froze, uncertain. CLA knelt beside her, encouraging softly. "Extend your hand, let him sniff." Hesitant fingers reached out. The terrier sniffed, then licked gently. A flicker of a smile crossed the woman's face. She whispered almost to herself, "I did not think they could be this gentle." CLA answered with a calm truth. "Show them kindness, and they return it tenfold." That evening as the sun dipped, Thomas reviewed their progress. Half the kennels cleaned, a section of fencing repaired, supplies reorganized. It was far from finished, but it was a beginning. As he sat with CLA sipping tea, Max limped into the room, his gait stiff but improving. He pressed his head into Thomas's knee, a silent reassurance that hope still remained. The general stroked him absent-mindedly, his eyes watching the tourists through the window. They were rough, broken in ways he did not yet understand. But he believed change was possible. People did not transform overnight. Yet given the right path, the right challenge, the right reflection, they could. Whether these tourists would rise to that chance was yet unknown. But Thomas Bennett was determined to see it through. The morning light spilled across the valley, gilding the rooftops of the small mountain village. The air was crisp, carrying the smell of dew and the faint sound of church bells in the distance. At the edge of the village the animal shelter stood waiting, its worn wooden doors creaking in the wind, its fences leaning in surrender to time. It had been built years ago with good intentions but little funding. Now it was a place of need, barely keeping the creatures safe. Broken kennels sat in rows, straw scattered across damp concrete floors. Inside, dogs whined softly, their eyes following anyone who passed, their bodies trembling with both hunger and hope. The tourists arrived reluctantly, their steps dragging, their expressions heavy with annoyance. Derek, the tall man with broad shoulders and a permanent scowl, muttered under his breath about wasted time. Lisa, a quiet redhead, kept her arms folded, glancing at the animals with unease. Karen, sharp-tongued and restless, tapped her foot impatiently. The others followed in silence, their faces pale, their clothes too clean for what awaited. They had spent their lives chasing comfort, not labor. But under the steady gaze of Thomas Bennett there was no room for excuses. Thomas stood at the entrance, his arms crossed, his posture still carrying the authority of a commander. At his side was CLA, holding a clipboard with the day's task. Behind them Max lay in the shade, still weak but alert, his eyes fixed on the strangers who had caused him pain. His tail twitched but he made no sound, watching with a patient suspicion. Thomas spoke evenly, his voice steady as stone. Today you will clean the kennels, repair the fencing, and feed the animals. You will work until the tasks are done. Complaints will not be tolerated. CLA will guide you. If you treat this as punishment, you will fail. If you treat this as a chance, you may yet learn something worth carrying home. His gaze swept over them, sharp and unyielding. The tourists shifted uncomfortably, but none dared protest aloud. The work began in silence. Buckets of water were dragged across the yard, soap foamed as brushes scraped away filth that had gathered for months. The smell was strong, bitter, a mixture of disinfectant and decay. Derek gagged as he scooped waste from a kennel, his muttering louder now. "This is disgusting. Why are we doing this?" CLA's voice cut through, calm yet firm. "Because you helped cause pain. And pain must be met with care." Lisa crouched near a pen where puppies yipped behind rusty bars. Her hands trembled as she reached to pour food into their bowls. They barked excitedly, tails wagging, and one small pup pressed its nose against her hand. She froze, unsure whether to touch it. CLA noticed and knelt beside her. "They are only asking for kindness," she said softly. Lisa hesitated, then extended her fingers. The puppy licked them gently, and a spark of warmth lit her eyes for the first time. She whispered to herself, almost unheard, "Maybe they are not as frightening as I thought." Karen worked near the storage shed, her sharp comments filling the air. She criticized Derek for being slow, mocked Lisa for being timid, and argued with anyone who crossed her path. But her hands moved quickly, sorting supplies into neat rows, her mind oddly precise in organization. Though her words cut, her actions kept the work moving. By midday the group collapsed under a tree, their clothes soaked with sweat, their hands blistered. The sun beat down and silence settled heavy. For the first time since arriving, they looked less like carefree travelers and more like weary laborers. As they rested, a small terrier approached again. This time it wandered directly to Lisa, tail wagging shyly. She smiled faintly and patted its head. Karen scoffed, muttering that they were wasting time with affection. But when the dog turned toward her, eyes wide with innocence, even she softened, if only for a moment. Thomas observed from a distance, his expression unreadable. He saw the cracks forming in their resistance, the slow shift from defiance to reflection. He knew transformation did not come with lectures or punishment. It came through struggle, through moments of unexpected tenderness, through labor that stripped away arrogance. These were only the first step. That evening, after the day's work ended, the tourists gathered outside the shelter. Their bodies ached, their faces flushed with exhaustion. Some muttered complaints, others sat in silence. Thomas stood before them once more. "You have made progress," he said. But this is not about repairing kennels or fences. It is about repairing yourselves. Do not mistake sweat for redemption. Redemption is earned through change. His words lingered in the air, heavy and unavoidable. As the group dispersed, Max limped from the shadows. His body was still fragile, but his eyes burned with quiet strength. He moved toward Thomas, pressing against his leg, then turned his gaze to the tourists. For a long moment he simply stared, his tail still, his posture wary. Derek shifted uncomfortably under that gaze. Lisa lowered her head, unable to meet the dog's eyes. Karen crossed her arms but said nothing. Night fell over the village, but in the shelter the animals rested on cleaner straw, their bellies full for the first time in days. The air smelled fresher, the fences stood a little straighter, and the ground was free of filth. It was not enough, but it was a beginning. Inside his small room, Thomas sat beside Max, brushing his fur gently. He spoke in a low voice, words only the dog could hear. They will change or they will not. But we will not give up. Max sighed, his head resting on the general's knee, his eyes closing slowly. The next day began with heavier tasks. Wooden planks were carried, nails hammered into place, ropes pulled tight to mend broken enclosures. The tourists struggled with calloused hands, unused to labor. Derek cursed each nail that bent under his hammer, while Karen mocked his lack of skill. Yet when a beam nearly slipped from his grip, it was Karen who caught it, steadying it without hesitation. Their eyes met briefly, a flicker of respect buried beneath layers of hostility. Lisa was assigned to help feed the larger dogs. At first she trembled, her movements stiff, but gradually she learned to hold the bowls with confidence. One of the older dogs, scarred from years of neglect, pressed its head against her arm in silent gratitude. She felt tears sting her eyes, memories stirring of a dog she once had as a child, a dog she lost when her life fell apart. She whispered to herself, "I will not fail you this time." By afternoon their work had created visible change. A section of fencing stood strong, kennels were repaired, and the animals lay on clean bedding. The villagers began to notice, gathering at the gates to watch. Some whispered in surprise, others in approval. The same villagers who had stayed silent during the cruelty now murmured that perhaps justice was being done. But beneath the progress lay tension. Derek's temper flared often, clashing with Karen's sharp tongue. Lisa grew quiet, retreating into silence when arguments broke out. The other tourists floated between tasks, some working with effort, others pretending to help while waiting for the day to end. CLA watched them all with keen eyes, guiding, correcting, and reminding them that this was more than a chore. That evening, after another day of labor, Thomas gathered them by the fire pit. The flames cast long shadows across their faces. He spoke calmly, his voice carrying weight. "You are not here to build a shelter alone. You are here to build yourselves. If you cannot work together, you will fail. Tomorrow you will work as one group, on one task. A new play area for the dogs. It will not be easy. It will demand cooperation. But if you cannot do it, then all of this means nothing." The tourists shifted uncomfortably. Derek muttered something under his breath. Karen rolled her eyes. Lisa looked down at her hands. Yet none dared refuse. The fire crackled, sparks rising into the night. Max lay near Thomas, his gaze fixed on the group, as if measuring their worth. When the flames burned low and the night grew cold, the tourists retreated to their lodgings. Thomas remained by the fire, staring into the embers. CLA joined him, her face lit by the glow. "Do you think they can change?" she asked quietly. Thomas did not answer at once. He watched Max, who lifted his head, ears twitching at the sound of the wind. At last Thomas spoke. "People change when they are given the chance. Some take it, some do not. Our duty is to make sure the chance is there." The fire hissed as a log cracked, sending sparks into the night sky. The village was silent, the animals asleep, but Thomas Bennett sat awake, a soldier once more, guarding not only his dog but the fragile hope that even the cruel could learn compassion. The dawn broke with a faint mist curling across the valley. The grass was damp, glistening under the pale light, and the mountains loomed high with their silent presence. The villagers stirred slowly, yet at the animal shelter, movement had already begun. The day promised to be more difficult than the ones before, for the task awaiting the tourists was not one of individuals working alone but of a group forced to move as one. The general stood tall at the edge of the yard, his eyes surveying the scene with calm authority. Cla handed out gloves and tools, her instructions clear but firm. Today they would build a play area for the dogs. A space of joy in a world that had offered these creatures little kindness. The project was ambitious, requiring strength, patience, and coordination. Wooden beams had been stacked neatly, bags of cement rested nearby, ropes and toys waited to be hung once the structure stood. It was not simply about hammering nails or mixing cement. It was about communication, tolerance, and the ability to set aside pride. Derek and Karen were assigned to the framework. Their history of arguments made the choice deliberate. Thomas wanted them tested, forced to rely on one another despite their hostility. Lisa was paired with Chris, the quietest of the group, a man whose silence often hid behind lowered eyes and stiff shoulders. Their task was to create an obstacle course of tunnels and ramp. The others were scattered to carry supplies and mix cement under Cla's supervision. At first the air was heavy with tension. Derek's hammer struck wood with unnecessary force, his jaw tight, his frustration obvious. Karen measured beams with precision, correcting his angles with sharp remarks that only fueled his temper. They exchanged curt nods, avoiding direct words whenever possible. Yet as the hours passed, necessity forced cooperation. When a beam proved too heavy for Derek to lift alone, he gritted his teeth and asked for help. Karen hesitated, then stepped forward, her hands steadying the weight as he secured it. Their eyes met briefly, the faintest spark of recognition passing between them. Neither spoke, but the silence was less hostile than before. On the other side of the yard, Lisa knelt beside a tunnel frame, her hands trembling as she held the planks in place. Chris crouched beside her, his face blank, his words few. For a while they worked in silence, until Lisa broke it with a small laugh. She told him of a clumsy puppy that had tried to chase its own tail and ended up falling into a water bowl the day before. To her surprise, Chris's lips twitched into the faintest smile. "Sounds like he has more energy than I do," he muttered. It was the most he had spoken all week. Lisa's eyes brightened and for the first time, their work felt lighter. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the group. Sweat soaked their shirts, dust clung to their skin, but slowly the play area began to take shape. Wooden beams rose into a climbing structure, ramps stretched across the yard, and tunnels formed neat passages for the dogs to explore. The tourists, once disjointed strangers, began to fall into rhythm. Derek lifted, Karen steadied, Lisa guided, Chris measured. Even the others, who had resisted the hardest, found themselves caught in the momentum, their hands busy, their complaints fading. By late afternoon, the play area stood tall, rough but sturdy, colorful ropes and toys swaying gently in the breeze. The dogs, released from their kennels, rushed forward with joyous barks. Tails wagged, paws scrambled, and for the first time in weeks, laughter filled the shelter not from mockery but from genuine delight. The villagers who had gathered at the fence clapped softly, murmuring approval. The sight of once arrogant tourists working side by side, building something of worth, touched a nerve within the community. Thomas stepped forward, Max trotting faithfully at his side. The dog sniffed the new play area curiously, then barked once, sharp and approving. His tail wagged, and the general allowed himself a rare smile. "I think he approves," he said, his voice calm but proud. The group laughed, tension melting in the warmth of accomplishment. For a fleeting moment, they felt less like criminals atoning and more like a team. Yet beneath the surface, deeper struggles lingered. That evening, as the group rested near the fire pit, old wounds returned. Derek's temper, dulled during the day, flared once more. Karen, never one to let silence reign, snapped back at him. Lisa grew quiet, staring into the flames, her thoughts elsewhere. Chris retreated into silence again, his brief openness gone. The fragile unity of the day began to crumble in the darkness. Thomas watched, his eyes steady, his mind turning. Change was never a straight path. Progress was fragile, easily broken, but necessary. He let the argument burn itself out, then spoke when silence finally returned. "You worked together today," he said, his tone firm. "You proved you could. But unity is not tested when things are easy. It is tested when anger rises, when pride burns, when silence weighs heavy. If you fail each other in those moments, then nothing you build will stand." His words fell like stones into still water, ripples spreading through their thoughts. None replied, but their faces betrayed unease. Later that night, Lisa sat apart, her eyes glistening with unspoken memories. She thought of Daisy, the timid puppy who had begun to follow her every step. Daisy reminded her of Bella, the dog she had loved as a child but lost when her home fell apart. The memory haunted her, filling her with guilt and longing. She whispered into the darkness, "I will not abandon you again, Daisy." Karen, passing by, overheard but said nothing. For the first time she looked at Lisa not with mockery but with something resembling respect. The next morning brought new storms. Not of rain or wind, but of emotions boiling over. Derek struggled with a stubborn nail, his frustration spilling into sharp words. Karen teased him, her sarcasm cutting deeper than intended. Their clash grew louder, drawing the others into tense silence. It was Lisa who stepped between them, her voice trembling but steady. "Enough," she said. "We are all tired, but fighting will not help." Karen rolled her eyes, muttering under her breath, but she stepped back. Derek lowered his hammer, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking to Lisa with reluctant gratitude. That evening, Thomas and CLA called the group together. The fire pit crackled, casting long shadows across weary faces. CLA's voice was calm but firm. "Tomorrow you will work on one task again, but this time it will require more than labor. It will require patience. You will build not for strength, but for joy." The group exchanged uncertain glances, weary but intrigued. As the fire burned low, Thomas's gaze lingered on them. They were still rough, still resistant, but cracks had formed in their walls. Through labor, through conflict, through moments of unexpected tenderness, they were beginning to change. Whether they realized it or not, the weight of their actions was pressing into their hearts. The general knew the hardest battles were yet to come. But he also knew that in those battles lay the seeds of redemption. The days at the shelter continued with rhythm, yet beneath the surface tension grew. What had begun as reluctant labor turned slowly into fragile routine. The tourists woke each morning with sore muscles, their hands rougher than before, their clothes stained with dirt and sweat. Yet despite progress, bitterness lingered. Derek grumbled whenever work became heavy, Karen mocked his efforts, Lisa retreated into silence, and Chris faded into the background. One afternoon their fragile balance broke. The group was tasked with repairing a kennel frame. Derek hammered nails with heavy blows, frustration plain. Karen passed carrying a bucket of water and smirked. "Maybe if you hit the nail instead of the wood it would actually go in," she said, her voice sharp. Derek's jaw tightened. "You want to try, be my guest."